The history of Black Americans is deeply intertwined with the theft of identity. For centuries, the transatlantic slave trade ripped Africans from their homelands, stripping them of their names, languages, and cultures. This erasure was systematic and brutal, designed to disconnect enslaved Africans from their past and control their future. But the story of Black American identity is not just a story of loss. It is also a story of resilience, adaptation, and the creation of a vibrant and unique culture in the face of unimaginable adversity. Despite the horrors of slavery, Black Americans forged a new identity, drawing on their African heritage while adapting to the realities of their new world. This process was further complicated by the deliberate erasure of indigenous identities in America. The forced removal and assimilation of indigenous peoples created a void in the historical narrative, one that often overlooked the connections between African and indigenous communities. This essay will delve into the historical forces that sought to erase Black American identities, examining the roles of slavery, indigenous reclassification, and land dispossession. By comparing mainstream historical narratives with alternative perspectives, we can begin to understand the true scope of this erasure and its lasting impact on Black American identity and culture. It is time to uncover these hidden truths, to acknowledge the resilience of a people who have fought to preserve their heritage in the face of overwhelming odds. The journey to reclaim our lost identities is a journey of healing, of understanding, and of reclaiming our rightful place in the tapestry of human history. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrific chapter in human history, responsible for the forced migration of millions of Africans to the Americas. More than just a system of forced labor, slavery was a deliberate attempt to erase African identities and replace them with a narrative of inferiority designed to justify their enslavement. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved Africans were stripped of their names, their languages, and their cultural practices. Families were torn apart, children were separated from their parents, and individuals were scattered across plantations, making it nearly impossible to maintain their cultural traditions. The use of African languages was forbidden, and enslaved people were forced to adopt the language of their captors. Traditional religions and spiritual practices were suppressed, replaced by Christianity, often through coercion and violence. This systematic stripping away of identity was designed to break the spirits of enslaved Africans, to make them more compliant and easier to control. By severing ties to their past, slaveholders aimed to create a population with no sense of history, no sense of belonging, and no hope for a future beyond the plantation. Yet, despite these brutal attempts at cultural genocide, Black Americans resisted. They held onto fragments of their heritage, passing down stories, songs, and traditions in secret. They created new forms of cultural expression, blending African rhythms and melodies with European musical forms to create entirely new genres like blues and jazz. The resilience of Black culture in the face of such adversity is a testament to the strength and spirit of those who endured the unimaginable horrors of slavery. While the transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas, it was not the only system of oppression at play. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas also marked the beginning of a brutal campaign of colonization and genocide against indigenous peoples. Through forced assimilation, land dispossession, and outright violence, European colonizers sought to erase indigenous identities and claim the land for themselves. One of the key tactics used to undermine indigenous communities was the reclassification of their identities. Indigenous peoples were often categorized as mulatto, colored, or Black in official records, obscuring their true ancestry and making it easier to justify their displacement and dispossession. This reclassification had a profound impact on the historical narrative, erasing the presence of indigenous peoples from many parts of the Americas and creating a false dichotomy between Black and Indian identities. This deliberate blurring of lines served the interests of the colonizers in several ways. By lumping indigenous peoples in with enslaved Africans, they hope to minimize the scale of their genocide against Native Americans. It also created divisions within communities of color, making it more difficult to build solidarity and resistance against colonial rule. The erasure of indigenous identities through reclassification had a significant impact on the development of Black American identity. By obscuring the historical connections between African and indigenous communities, it created a fragmented and incomplete picture of the past. This fragmentation continues to have repercussions today as we struggle to understand the complex tapestry of Black American ancestry and heritage. Land is more than just a physical space. It is deeply intertwined with identity, culture, and spirituality. For indigenous peoples, the land is their ancestor, their provider, and their connection to the past, present, and future. The forced removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands was therefore not just a matter of physical displacement. It was a profound assault on their identities and their very way of life. Through treaties that were often broken, forced relocation to reservations, and outright violence, European colonizers systematically severed the ties between indigenous peoples and their lands. This dispossession had a devastating impact on indigenous communities, leading to cultural disruption, economic hardship, and the loss of traditional knowledge and practices. The impact of land dispossession on Black American identity is often overlooked. However, it is essential to remember that many enslaved Africans were brought to work on land stolen from indigenous peoples. This shared experience of displacement created a complex dynamic between Black and indigenous communities, one marked by both solidarity and tension. The legacy of land dispossession continues to affect both Black and indigenous communities today. The loss of land has contributed to economic disparities, health inequities, and the ongoing struggle for self-determination. Recognizing the interconnectedness of these experiences is crucial for building solidarity and working towards a more just and equitable future. Section 5. The power of narrative mainstream history versus alternative truths. For generations, the dominant narrative of American history has been told from a Eurocentric perspective, one that minimizes the contributions of Black people and often ignores or distorts their experience. This mainstream narrative has shaped our understanding of the past, influencing everything from textbooks to popular culture. However, in recent years, there has been a growing movement to challenge these dominant narratives and unearth the hidden histories that have been silenced for far too long. Mainstream history often presents a simplified and sanitized version of the past, one that emphasizes progress while downplaying or even denying the injustices that have been perpetrated against Black people. This sanitized version of history often fails to acknowledge the complexities of race, power, and identity in America. It often omits the voices of those who were most impacted by historical events, leaving us with an incomplete and often inaccurate understanding of the past. Alternative perspectives, on the other hand, seek to challenge these dominant narratives by centering the experiences of Black people who have been marginalized and silenced. These alternative histories draw on a wider range of sources, including oral histories, personal accounts, and archival materials that have been overlooked or ignored by mainstream historians. By amplifying these marginalized voices, we can gain a more nuanced and accurate understanding of the past. The process of uncovering these hidden histories is not always easy. It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about our nation's past and to question the narratives that we have been taught to accept as fact. However, it is essential work if we are to create a more just and equitable future. The erasure of indigenous identities has made it difficult to trace the full extent of African and indigenous connections in the Americas. However, Despite the challenges, there is growing evidence to suggest that these connections run deeper and wider than previously acknowledged. From DNA testing to historical records, researchers and communities are piecing together a more complete picture of the past. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from the field of genetics. DNA testing has revealed that a significant number of Black Americans have indigenous ancestry. This is not surprising given the historical context of slavery and colonization, where intermixing between African, indigenous, and European populations was common. These genetic connections challenge the traditional binary view of race and highlight the fluidity of identity throughout history. Beyond DNA, historical records also provide glimpses into the interconnectedness of African and indigenous communities. For example, there are accounts of enslaved Africans escaping from plantations and finding refuge with indigenous tribes. Some of these escapees were integrated into indigenous communities, marrying into families and adopting their customs and traditions. Furthermore, there are historical records of Black and indigenous communities fighting side by side in resistance movements against colonial rule. These alliances were often based on shared experiences of oppression and a desire for liberation. These stories of solidarity and resistance challenge the dominant narrative of racial division and highlight the shared struggle for justice and equality. The historical erasure of Black American identities continues to have a profound impact on modern Black community. The systematic stripping away of language, culture, and history has created a void that can be felt in everything from family traditions to self-perception. This loss of heritage can manifest in a variety of ways, from a sense of rootlessness to a disconnect from one's own history. One of the most significant impacts of this erasure is the fragmentation of Black American identity. Without a clear understanding of their ancestral roots, many Black Americans struggle to piece together their own personal narrative. This can lead to a sense of disconnection from the past and a feeling of not fully belonging. The erasure of indigenous ancestry has further complicated this process. Many Black Americans are unaware of their indigenous heritage, and those who are often lack the cultural framework to understand and embrace this part of their identity. This lack of awareness can contribute to a sense of cultural ambiguity and make it difficult to connect with the broader indigenous community. The historical trauma of slavery and colonialism continues to cast a long shadow on Black American community. The intergenerational trauma of these experiences can manifest in a variety of ways, from mental health disparities to socioeconomic inequities. Despite these challenges, Black Americans have demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity in the face of adversity. They have built vibrant and dynamic cultures, drawing on their African heritage while adapting to the realities of their new world. In recent years, there has been a growing movement within Black communities to reclaim their lost heritage. This movement is about more than just uncovering historical facts. It is about healing from the trauma of erasure and reclaiming a sense of wholeness. It is about understanding how the past continues to shape the present and using that knowledge to build a more just and equitable future. Reclaiming our roots begins with acknowledging the full scope of the erasure that has taken place. It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about our nation's past and to challenge the dominant narratives that have been used to justify injustice. It also requires us to listen to the voices of those who have been silenced for far too long and to center their experiences in our understanding of history. There are many ways to engage in this process of reclamation. Some people are turning to genealogy research to trace their family histories and uncover lost connections to their ancestral past. Others are exploring traditional African spiritual practices or learning about the history and culture of their ancestors. This process of reclaiming our roots is not just about the past, it is also about the present and the future. By understanding the ways in which our identities have been shaped by history, we can begin to heal from the trauma of erasure and build a stronger sense of self. We can also use this knowledge to challenge ongoing forms of oppression and to create a more just and equitable world for ourselves and for future generations. The journey to uncover the hidden roots of Black American identity is ongoing. It requires a collective effort to challenge dominant narratives, amplify marginalized voices, and reclaim the lost histories that have been stolen from us. This is not just about righting past wrongs. It is about creating a more just and equitable future for all. We must continue to support research and scholarship that sheds light on the complex history of Black and Indigenous relations in the Americas. We must demand that our education systems teach a more inclusive and accurate history, one that acknowledges the contributions and experiences of all people. We must also support efforts to preserve and revitalize Black and Indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions. This includes supporting Black and Indigenous artists, writers, and storytellers who are keeping these traditions alive. It means creating spaces where these cultures can be celebrated and shared with future generations. The erasure of Black and Indigenous identities was a deliberate attempt to disconnect us from our past and control our future. By reclaiming our roots, we are not only honoring the resilience of our ancestors, but we are also shaping a future where our identities are celebrated, our histories are acknowledged, and our voices are heard. Thank you for listening. Please give a thumbs up and subscribe.